began with a mansion that was never a home in the ordinary sense. From a distance, it looked like a European palace mistakenly dropped on American soil, a sprawling stone edifice with terraces carved like opera balconies, chimneys rising like battlements, and a roofline that resembled the angled geometry of Renaissance fortresses. But to understand its true nature, you had to step behind the polished marble, past the great hall, and into the maze that stretched beyond the sight of polite society. For this was not merely a house, it was an ecosystem: 100 rooms, 40 bedrooms, a dining hall the size of a railway station, a kitchen built with industrial furnaces meant to feed a full regiment, and beneath all of it, unseen, unmentioned, and essential, were the servants who kept this vast organism alive. Visitors who arrived for dinner saw only the glittering surface, the chandeliers imported from France, the mahogany staircases polished until they blinded the eyes, the elaborate tapestries depicting stories no one bothered to read. They never saw the doors that were engineered to blend into wallpaper, the hallways that turned sharply downward into the shadows, or the elevator shafts reserved strictly for staff. They saw the orchestra, but not the years of training it took to ensure not a single note was played out of tune. The Gilded Age was an era of showmanship, and nothing was more carefully constructed than the illusion of effortlessness. When guests walked through those towering doors, they were meant to believe that opulence was natural, that the house woke itself, cleaned itself, dressed itself, and glowed on its own. But the truth lived in the unseen corridors, more than 100 servants, each performing a task that was both essential and invisible. At sunrise, before any member of the family stirred, the mansion was already humming with movement. The butler, dressed in crisp black before dawn, conducted the morning like a conductor preparing for an overture. While frost still clung to the windows, housemaids swept through the rooms in soft-soled shoes, clearing last night's traces with the precision of clockwork. Footmen polished silver until it reflected like water. Gardeners trimmed vast lawns in silence, knowing that even the faintest sound could disturb the illusion of perfection above. It was a world where hierarchy ruled more strictly than in any society ballroom. Above the basement, but below the grandeur of the main floors, existed a parallel universe shaped by discipline, order, and endurance. A scullery maid might never exchange a single word with a footman she passed 100 times a day. A personal lady's maid could command more respect within these walls than a chamberlain who oversaw entire wings. And the cook, who presided over her enormous domain like a general from behind her stoves, answered only to the butler, and even then, not always quietly. Every square foot of the mansion demanded labor: chandeliers with hundreds of crystals that needed dusting individually, marble floors that required polishing daily, drapes so heavy that it took 2 men to draw them open each morning. Linens were washed, ironed, and folded in quantities that rivaled hotels. Coal furnaces were fed constantly to maintain warmth across sprawling halls. Even the walls had to be brushed down regularly, their ornate carvings trapping dust like delicate nets. The family and their guests rarely considered this world except when something went wrong. The water temperature was off, a light burned out, a fire sputtered in a sitting room not currently in use. To them, these inconveniences were mild disturbances. To the staff, they were failures, and failures were unacceptable in a household that defined itself by perfection. A formal dinner required the hands of nearly 60 people. A single guest room could involve 12 different roles. A weekend event demanded coordination that rivaled military operations. Visitors often remarked that the mansion felt alive, its lights shifting as if by instinct, the dining room transforming during the evening as though guided by magic. Yet nothing here happened without effort, and none of that effort was accidental. Servants were expected to be present without existing, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move silently through a house that wanted to look as though it ran on its own breath. What made this world so fascinating was not simply the wealth behind it, but the way it was constructed: hidden layers built beneath the polished stone, an underground network of tunnels, staircases, and service passages intended to keep the grand machinery turning without exposing its gears. Those who lived in the upper floors saw grandeur. Those below saw only duty. And in a way, this hidden world, more than the gold, more than the imported marble, more than the lavish social displays, was the true engine of the Gilded Age. For what the public admired as elegance, servants lived as labor. What society envied as effortless grace, the staff understood as exhausting routine. The same house that glittered under evening lights felt very different at 4 in the morning. It is this contrast, the world above and the world below, that reveals the truth behind America's most astonishing mansions. And the story of how these palaces truly functioned, how they rose and eventually fell, begins here, with the people who worked tirelessly, endlessly, and largely anonymously to keep them alive. And as the Gilded Age expanded, so did the demands placed upon those who served, shaping a system that would become both legendary and unsustainable. Long before the mansion became a world unto itself, before the footmen moved in synchronized silence, and the scullery maids scrubbed the stone floors before dawn, there was a man, or sometimes a couple, whose ambition outgrew the boundaries of the age they were born into. The Gilded Age did not simply produce wealth, it produced figures who reshaped the skyline, the economy, and even the very meaning of status in America. This house, like so many others of its kind, did not begin with marble. It began with hunger, not hunger for food, but hunger for arrival, the desire to be seen, to be acknowledged, to enter a social world that had been closed to their parents and their grandparents. The American elite of the mid-19th century was small and tightly guarded, built on the last names of shipping dynasties, old mercantile families, and those who could trace their fortunes to the earliest years of the Republic. But the industrial boom changed everything. Railroads, steel mills, coal mines, banks, and factories erupted across the nation, and with them rose a new class of moguls whose fortunes surpassed anything the old guard could imagine. The founder of this mansion's wealth was one of those men, a businessman whose timing aligned with the country's most explosive transformation. He had arrived in New York or Boston or Philadelphia as a young man with little more than determination and an uncanny ability to read markets before they shifted. He saw opportunities in things most people overlooked: cheap land near emerging rail hubs, failing ironworks that could be revived with new techniques, undervalued companies poised for industrial expansion. His rise was not elegant, it was relentless. Over decades, he built an empire that expanded from one city to another, stretching into industries that touched nearly every household in America. Newspapers wrote about him, often with a tone of suspicion: too young to possess such power, too aggressive in his tactics, too unapologetic about his success. Yet the more society whispered, the more he prospered. He understood the Gilded Age's unspoken rule: money did not simply open doors, it carved new ones. But wealth alone was not enough. Not then, not for him. By the 1880s, those who had amassed enormous fortunes were faced with a new challenge: how to be accepted among families whose reputations, not bank accounts, defined their influence. The old money families measured status in generations, not in dollars. They valued lineage over expansion, heritage over ambition, ballroom etiquette over industrial conquest. The founder of this great house had no such lineage to offer. But he understood something else. If bloodlines could not open the door, grandeur could break the walls entirely. So he did what many of his contemporaries did. He built a mansion so large, so elaborate, so unmistakably European in its sensibilities that even the most traditional families could not ignore it. It was not built to be lived in comfortably. It was built to be presented, a monument to success, a declaration of permanence. The architect he hired was at the height of his fame, a master of beaux arts design whose name alone signaled prestige. The blueprints were drawn to rival estates in France and England. Nothing was left to practicality. Imported marble from Italy, stained glass from Munich, chandeliers from Paris, tapestries from Brussels, and entire carved ceilings shipped from Europe like treasures returning home. The founder traveled abroad with his spouse, purchasing art, furniture, sculptures, and rugs as if he were assembling a museum rather than a residence. Every acquisition had a purpose: to signal that the family belonged not merely to American high society, but to a lineage of taste and refinement that transcended oceans. Newspapers wrote breathlessly about the construction, calling it the palace of the century. Social columnists speculated whether the family's first grand ball would force the old guard to acknowledge them. Some scoffed, others remarked privately that the sheer scale of the project made resistance more difficult. The house, even in its unfinished state, had become a character in its own right, a looming presence threatening to reshape social hierarchies. Yet for all the attention the rising family received, little was said about the machine that would be required to sustain such a monument. Servants were rarely mentioned in print except as numbers, but behind those numbers were lives: immigrants, freedmen, young women from rural towns, people who sought stability or escape and found themselves inside walls far more imposing than they expected. The founder, in his quest for legitimacy, understood that the illusion of effortlessness demanded invisible labor. A mansion of this scale could not simply be built. It had to be operated flawlessly, continuously, silently. And so, even before the family moved in, recruiters were sent to cities and countryside alike, seeking men and women who could fill the dozens upon dozens of roles required. The household staff was assembled with almost the same precision as the architectural plans. a butler with experience in an English ducal estate, a chef who had trained in Paris, housemaids fluent in quiet obedience, gardeners capable of overseeing acres of manicured grounds. Chauffeurs, laundresses, governesses, valets, footmen, seamstresses, furnace men, each selected as carefully as the marble that lined the hallways. The founder believed that he was building a legacy. What he created was a world where the upper floors glowed with imported luxury while the lower floors buzzed with ceaseless labor. A world where the family dined on French courses served in gilded dishes while servants counted steps to ensure no sound betrayed their presence. A world where the man who had risen from modest beginnings now lived in a palace operated by people whose lives resembled the one he had escaped. This contradiction, this elegant, immaculate facade supported by invisible human effort, would become the defining truth of the mansion. And as the Gilded Age accelerated, the demands placed upon that hidden world would grow larger, harsher, and increasingly impossible to sustain. For with every new level of grandeur came a new level of expectation, and the servants who lived below the marble floors would be the ones expected to uphold it. By the time the mansion rose above its surrounding hills, casting its long afternoon shadow across the countryside, America had entered an age unlike anything it had seen before. The nation was young enough to dream, rich enough to indulge, and reckless enough to blur the line between aspiration and extravagance. This era, later called the Gilded Age, was a time of extraordinary contradictions, and the mansion stood as a perfect expression of them. To understand how a household required more than 100 servants, one must understand the era that demanded such grandeur. In cities like New York, Newport, and Chicago, fortunes multiplied at speeds that left even their owners breathless. Millionaires, once rare, became almost commonplace among railroad titans and industrial barons. They built opera houses, endowed universities, acquired art in quantities that rivaled European aristocracy. Yet beneath their displays of refinement lay the fierce competitiveness of men who had built their empires through grit, ruthlessness, and timing. For the old families, those who traced their lineage to colonial merchants and revolutionary patriots, the influx of new wealth was unsettling. They saw these upstarts as too loud, too eager, too willing to show their money in ways that felt almost vulgar. But the newcomers did not care. They had carved their fortunes from steel and coal and had little interest in bowing to social hierarchies created long before their arrival. This tension, money versus lineage, ambition versus tradition, shaped every corner of American high society. The founders of the great mansion knew this. They did not simply want wealth, they wanted recognition. And recognition in the Gilded Age was not earned through quiet prosperity. It was earned through grandeur visible from miles away. The mansion they built was designed to compete not only with other homes, but with entire eras of European nobility. Its construction mirrored the broader cultural mood of the time, ambitious, dramatic, unrestrained. For the Gilded Age elite, architecture became a form of language and every stone spoke. Columns suggested antiquity, grand staircases implied ascendancy, imported frescoes whispered cultured sophistication. Even the landscaping, endless lawns trimmed to perfection, signaled a version of control over nature that Americans of an earlier generation could hardly imagine. But what made these homes most extraordinary was not the marble or the chandeliers. It was the scale of operation required to make them appear effortless. In England, aristocratic families had centuries of tradition guiding their estate households. In France, master-servant protocols were practically codified. But America, new, restless, improvisational, had no such traditions. The Gilded Age elite were inventing their version of aristocracy in real time, and with it, the structure of a domestic world that had to function with military precision. To the social elite, the mansion was a symbol of permanence. To the servants, it was a factory hidden behind silk curtains. Every societal expectation created another layer of labor. Electric lighting meant electricians on staff. Indoor plumbing meant plumbers and maintenance crews. Dozens of fireplaces required men to haul coal day and night. French cuisine meant an entire kitchen brigade trained for hours of preparation. Formal entertaining became the axis around which their lives revolved. Dinner parties could last 5 hours. Balls could draw 2,000 people. Afternoon teas required trays that moved like clockwork through rooms designed to impress. Fashion intensified the pressure. Gowns with 20 buttons, gloves needing special handling, jewelry kept under watch, shoes polished between engagements. Society itself acted as a stage, and the family, like every wealthy family of the age, was expected to perform flawlessly, but perfection had a cost. While the upper floors flowed with champagne, laughter, and soft candlelight, the floors below echoed with footsteps, commands, and the low, constant hum of work that began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Servants' lives were structured around a hierarchy stricter than anything found upstairs. Domestic roles were influenced by European traditions, yet adapted to American demands, creating a hybrid system that relied heavily on discipline and endurance. The butler stood at the top of this hierarchy, commanding the household with quiet authority. The housekeeper oversaw every maid, ensuring each bed crease, each polished banister, each folded linen met the standard. Cooks ruled the kitchen with absolute certainty. Footmen memorized timing down to the second. Ladies' maids navigated the delicate world of personal service with near invisible grace. The servants were expected to be present but unseen, to hear without listening, to observe but never acknowledge. They moved like shadows through hallways guests never noticed, passing through service corridors designed intentionally to preserve the illusion of effortlessness. This divide between the world of glittering social performance and the world of relentless labor reflected the era itself. America was changing so quickly, so dramatically, that many clung to spectacle as a way to reassure themselves of stability. Yet beneath the spectacle lay the truth. The engine of the Gilded Age was not the families in the ballrooms, but the men and women whose work allowed those ballrooms to exist. And every year, as fortunes grew and expectations rose, the pressure on the servants grew heavier, more constant, and more dependent on systems that could not be sustained forever. Because while the family's ascent seemed unstoppable, the world that powered their grandeur carried tensions of its own, tensions that would eventually reshape both the mansion and the servants who ran it. For in this age of unprecedented wealth, the true cost of living, like royalty, was borne by those whose names rarely appeared in any record at all. If the mansion was a monument to ambition, then the family who inhabited it became the carefully engineered centerpiece of a performance staged for society's most watchful eyes. Nothing in the Gilded Age mattered more than appearance, not mere beauty, but the kind of cultivated elegance that signaled belonging, taste, and power. And the family understood this perfectly. They did not simply live in their mansion, they displayed it. From the moment the heavy oak doors opened to guests, the house transformed into a theater where every light, every footstep, every folded napkin served a purpose. Society pages chronicled the family's comings and goings with breathless excitement. Who they dined with, which European artists they patronized, what gowns the lady of the house wore to the Metropolitan Ball, how their summer retreat compared to the estates in Newport or Lenox. The public image they presented was one of seamless prosperity, as if the marble floors polished themselves and the floral arrangements grew naturally in perfect symmetry. To uphold that illusion, the servants moved like the gears of an intricate clock. Guests rarely understood that the dinner parties they attended were not spontaneous affairs, but orchestrations that began days in advance. Florists delivered crates of roses and orchids. The chef planned multi-course menus requiring imported ingredients. The butler perfected seating arrangements to ensure no guest felt slighted. Footmen practiced synchronized service, rehearsing the placement of each plate, each wine pour, each gloved movement. The family knew that the smallest misstep, a lukewarm soup, a wrinkled tablecloth, a misplaced card, could ripple through the tightly knit world of society gossip. Newspapers often portrayed the family as naturally refined, their success portrayed as inevitable, even destined. They appeared in illustrations standing beneath chandeliers, walking through gardens with parasols, ascending marble staircases in silk gowns. Yet those pictures captured only the surface, the version of life meant for public consumption. Beneath that surface, the machinery of image-making was relentless. The lady of the house kept a schedule as demanding as any industrialist's. From early afternoon until late in the evening, she moved between fittings, luncheons, charity committees, art exhibitions, opera appearances, and seasonal planning for social events. Her wardrobe required the constant attention of personal maids who ironed delicate fabrics, repaired lace, brushed velvet, and monitored jewelry with quiet vigilance. Every outfit had a purpose: to impress, to belong, to assert her family's rising place among the elite. Her husband's role was no less constructed. He was expected to display not only wealth but gravitas, donations to libraries, endowments to hospitals, discreet appearances at gentlemen's clubs, and investments that suggested civic responsibility. His public persona required the support of secretaries, chauffeurs, carriage men, and a valet who prepared him each day as carefully as one might prepare a diplomat. But the most delicate part of their public image was not their wealth or their charity. It was their home. The mansion was their calling card, a statement so immense that it could not be ignored. Invitations to their gatherings were coveted because stepping through those doors was a declaration of one's own status. Guests left with stories they would share for years. The four-story atrium lit entirely by candles, the drawing room furnished with French antiques, the dining table capable of seating 60 guests under a dome painted with celestial scenes. Yet what impressed the guests most was not the scale, but the smoothness of it all, the sense that the house operated without resistance. Footmen appeared before a guest could even reach for a dropped glove. Tea arrived at the precise moment a conversation shifted. Fires crackled perfectly. Music drifted from unseen musicians as if the house itself exhaled melody. The family never acknowledged the servants who made this world function. They didn't have to. In the Gilded Age, invisibility was the hallmark of perfect service. Even their children were drawn into this world of appearances. They learned French, dancing, etiquette, piano, and history, not merely for education, but to reflect the sophistication their parents wished to project. Their tutors and governesses worked quietly behind the scenes, ensuring that the young heirs moved through society with the bearing expected of families who built empires or wished to appear as though they belonged to one. But behind the shimmering facade were private tensions the public never saw. Maintaining perfection demanded relentless pressure. Each public appearance added weight to the next. Each grand event raised expectations. Each new article praising their hospitality fueled deeper scrutiny. And in homes across the Gilded Age, this pressure often revealed fractures, quiet resentments, marital distance, whispered arguments over financial risks masked behind charity galas. For now, however, the facade held. To the world, the family appeared unshakable, a symbol of harmony, elegance, and boundless prosperity. Their mansion stood as proof that they had arrived, perhaps even surpassed the old guard who once doubted them. But beneath the polished ballroom floors and the gilded picture frames, the unseen world continued its ceaseless labor. And as expectations grew, so did the strain on those who upheld the illusion. Because every layer of grandeur placed new weight on the servants' shoulders, and the cracks forming beneath the marble would soon begin to show. For all the smooth orchestration and immaculate presentation, no mansion of this magnitude remained untouched by pressure. Wealth could build walls of marble, but it could not silence the weight pressing against them. And inside the household, behind the orderly routines, behind the perfect dinners, behind the glittering illusions admired by society, the first signs of strain began to appear. The servants noticed it long before the family did. They always did. In a house of 100 rooms, nothing stayed private for long. Servants heard footsteps that came too late at night, voices that rose just slightly behind closed doors, and silences that lasted longer than they once had. They noticed when the lady of the house took her morning tea alone more often than before, or when her correspondence increased, or when a bouquet arrived from a name not frequently mentioned. They noticed when the master's study stayed lit past midnight, and when he arrived to breakfast already irritated, scanning the newspapers with a tension around the eyes that had not always been there. The housekeeper, who ruled the servants' quarters with quiet precision, understood the rhythms of the family better than the family understood themselves. She saw changes in the smallest details, linens sent down more frequently, an unusual number of dresses needing mending, moments where a maid returned from an errand upstairs with an expression she tried to hide. She knew without being told that the atmosphere above was shifting, a delicate imbalance beginning to ripple through the household. For the servants, recognizing these shifts was not gossip, it was survival. Tension in the upper floors always meant more labor below. Small cracks became burdensome ones. A misplaced item led to an accusation. A frayed hem became an urgent repair. A forgotten appointment triggered a flurry of preparation. A single broken glass, once trivial, suddenly carried the weight of an entire afternoon's anxiety. Servants stepped more carefully, spoke less, worked faster. When a household this grand grew unstable, those who bore the heaviest consequences were the ones who served it. The butler, whose authority defined the entire structure of service, sensed these early fractures with quiet dread. His position demanded perfection, diplomacy, and unwavering calm, yet even he struggled when the family's moods became unpredictable. The harmony that once guided the staff's routines began to wobble, and with it, the precise machinery of the household. When the family's tensions rose, the servants paid for it in hours, longer days, tighter directives, stricter scrutiny. The kitchen felt the changes most intensely. The chef noticed when the lady of the house sent meals back untouched, blaming seasoning she once loved. The scullery maid noticed when the master demanded late-night plates, though he had earlier declared no appetite. Food became a barometer of the house's emotions, rising and falling with the moods upstairs. Even the children sensed the shift. Their laughter, once a familiar background sound drifting from the nursery, softened. Lessons became quieter. The governess maintained order with the same composed voice, but she was not immune to the subtle tension settling over the mansion like a thin veil. And the servants, who were expected to be invisible, found themselves witnessing the fragile truth of a family that society believed was unshakable. These cracks did not always come from the family alone. The Gilded Age itself was beginning to change. The pressure to host larger events grew each season. Balls became more elaborate, dinners more elaborate still. Newspapers fixated on extravagance with increasing intensity, pushing wealthy families to outdo one another in spectacle. The mansion's grandeur, once impressive on its own, was now compared to every new estate rising along the coast or in the city. Expectations grew heavier, budgets grew tighter, competition grew sharper. Inside the house, stress manifested in ways that servants could feel before they understood. There were days when the family spoke in clipped sentences, days when the master left without announcing where he was going, days when the lady retreated to her private sitting room for hours, her delicate slippers silent against the rug. Servants maintained their composure, but in their shared glances, brief and discreet, they acknowledged what could not be spoken aloud. A household this large required unity at the top. Without it, the machine faltered. For now, the cracks remained mostly hidden from society's view. The mansion still dazzled from the outside, its windows bright with evening light, its halls ready to welcome prestigious guests. But inside, the weight of perfection grew heavier than ever, and each new expectation placed upon the family tightened the strain on those who labored beneath them. There was no single moment when the equilibrium broke, no dramatic event that marked the beginning of decline. Instead, the shift was gradual, like a rope pulled tighter and tighter until the first threads began to fray. And in the servants' quarters, where whispers were soft and fears were quieter still, a subtle understanding spread. Something in the house was changing. And once the cracks began to show, they rarely healed. Every great Gilded Age mansion carried secrets, but not all of them held the power to shake the entire household. In this house, the turning point arrived quietly, not with an explosion, not with a confrontation, but with a whisper. And like most whispers, it began in the one place where truth had nowhere to hide, the servants' quarters. It started as a fragment of a conversation overheard by a housemaid returning linens to the upstairs corridor, a door slightly ajar, a voice low, strained, a reply quiet, controlled, too controlled. The maid could not make out the words, but the tone lingered with her long after she stepped away. She said nothing, of course. Silence was part of the job, but silence did not erase awareness. A few days later, a footman noticed a letter placed hastily on the lady's writing desk, half covered by a lace glove. The script was elegant, unfamiliar, not the slanted writing of her husband, nor the careful loops of her sister's hand. He never read it, that would have been unthinkable. But even a glance at the unfamiliar stationery was enough to seed uncertainty. Small hints gathered like dust in corners no one bothered to sweep. A misplaced key, a locked drawer that had never been locked before, a guest who overstayed his visit by an hour, then two, then returned the next week with a bouquet that never made it to the main hall. None of these things alone were remarkable, but combined, they formed a pattern the staff recognized instinctively. They had seen it in other houses. They had witnessed how perfectly polished lives could unravel from the smallest of frayed threads. The scandal, though not yet fully visible, had begun. What triggered it depended on who was telling the story. Some said it began with the lady of the house, lonely, overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her, pressured to maintain an image that required constant performance. Others believed the master, worn down by business failures he refused to share, looked elsewhere for distraction. Still others whispered that the family's relentless need for social validation had left both spouses emotionally drained in ways neither could openly admit. But the servants' world did not run on speculation. It ran on observation. And what they observed day by day was a house slipping into quiet turmoil. The master grew more irritable, less patient, snapping at the butler for minor delays. The lady became more withdrawn, taking long carriage rides without explanation. Dinner conversations grew thin, the pauses between sentences grew longer. The children sensed the tension, though they could not understand its origin. Their governess held them close, reading stories with extra warmth, not because she was instructed to, but because she felt the need to shield them from the heaviness drifting through the halls. Servants began working with careful precision, avoiding mistakes that might draw unwanted attention. A misplaced vase could trigger an argument upstairs. A delayed tea tray could set off an entire chain reaction of irritation. In a household built on performance, the smallest crack could escalate quickly, and everyone downstairs understood this as if it were law. The mansion's social calendar began to shift as well. Dinners were postponed, invitations canceled. A grand summer event, long anticipated by society, was suddenly rescheduled. though no new date was announced. The newspapers, always eager for gossip, began to speculate about the family's absence from several prestigious gatherings. Their withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Then came the moment the servants had long sensed approaching. One cold morning, a letter arrived addressed not to the family but directly to the lady, delivered by hand rather than by post. The butler, trained to assess every detail, recognized immediately that this was no ordinary correspondence. The envelope bore no return address, only a crest he had not seen before, foreign, elegant, unmistakably personal. The lady accepted it in silence. She did not read it at once. She waited until the hallway was empty, until the last footstep faded. Only then did she retreat into her private sitting room and close the door. What happened behind that door no servant witnessed, but they heard what came after: a quiet, trembling breath, a chair leg scraping softly. And then, unmistakably, a single stifled sob. Servants did not speak of it aloud. They did not need to. The sound traveled through the household like smoke, slipping through the service passages, into the laundry rooms, down the narrow staircases, and into the kitchen where even the clatter of pots could not muffle the weight of it. Scandal had entered the house. Whether it was a private betrayal, a financial crisis uncovered, or a letter revealing a truth neither spouse had expected, the servants knew only this: the days of perfect presentation were over. Something had broken, and the house, for all its marble and grandeur, had no defense against what was coming, because in the Gilded Age, scandals did not stay quiet. They traveled swiftly, across dinner tables, through newspapers, into the parlors of rival families eager for the slightest crack in a competitor's reputation. And once a whisper escaped beyond the estate walls, no amount of wealth could call it back. The mansion's shining image was beginning to dim, and the hidden world that ran it was about to bear the full weight of the storm. The first public sign that something was wrong did not come from the family, nor from a newspaper, nor from a bold guest willing to gossip. It came from the house itself. A mansion this large, this meticulously orchestrated, did not simply run, it responded. When the upper floors fractured, the entire structure felt it. And the servants, who had sensed the tension long before society noticed, now found themselves caught in the center of a storm that no amount of training could prepare them for. The breaking point arrived not with one dramatic event, but with several small incidents cascading in rapid succession. It began with an argument, sharp, muffled, unmistakable, echoing down the main staircase at an hour when the family should have been preparing for an evening engagement. The butler, stationed near the hall, froze. Footmen halted mid-task. Housemaids paused as if afraid the sound might follow them. Arguments in private rooms were one thing. Arguments that spilled into public spaces were another. This was not merely a domestic dispute. It was a sign that the pressure had become too heavy to contain. The next day brought a financial blow the servants could not fully understand but clearly felt. A secretary from the master's business arrived unexpectedly, carrying ledgers and letters with an urgency that betrayed bad news. The master's voice rose once, not in anger, but in disbelief. Moments later, he dismissed the man and locked himself in his study. The staff heard him pacing for hours. By week's end, the household staff felt the shift in ways they could measure. Supplies were suddenly monitored more strictly. The steward cut orders the kitchen considered essential. The florist's deliveries grew modest. Even the coal room, normally stocked without question, received new restrictions. Servants knew what these changes meant. Something had gone wrong, gravely wrong, and the pressure above was beginning to descend. Then came the evening that would be remembered for years. A major dinner, small by the mansion's standards, but attended by several prominent families, had been scheduled weeks before. Canceling it would draw attention. Proceeding with it required perfection. And so, despite the turmoil behind closed doors, the machinery of the household went into motion. The dining room glowed. Footmen stood at attention. The table gleamed with silver polished until it reflected candlelight like mirrors. Guests arrived in jewels, silk, and anticipation. But no level of preparation could hide what happened next. The lady of the house entered the dining room late, so late that even the guests exchanged glances. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. The master followed moments later with a stiffness that suggested they had not entered the room together, nor intended to. Dinner began, and for a time the performance held. Conversation floated politely across the table, the orchestra played softly, and the servants moved with the smooth precision they had practiced countless times. Then one careless remark from a guest, an innocent question about an upcoming charity gala, shattered the illusion. The lady faltered. The master stiffened. A pause hung in the air, thin, fragile, dangerous. She answered with a brittle smile, but her voice carried a tremor. The master corrected her gently, but in a tone that sharpened the room's attention. Another guest added a comment, attempting to lighten the moment, but only deepening the tension. And then it happened, a crack in the facade so undeniable that even polite society could not pretend it had not seen. The lady placed her fork down, not angrily, not loudly, just deliberately. She excused herself from the table with a calmness that felt more devastating than an outburst would have. The master sat rigid, staring straight ahead. The room froze. Footmen, trained to detect every shift in atmosphere, felt the air tighten like a rope. The butler, standing near the door, lowered his gaze in silent recognition. The illusion had broken. The next morning, newspapers did not mention the dinner, but they did mention something else. A lawsuit had been filed against the master's company, alleging mismanagement. Rumors spread through gentlemen's clubs that his investments were in jeopardy. Whispers drifted through drawing rooms that the family had mortgaged part of their summer estate. Upstairs, the family withdrew into themselves. Downstairs, the servants felt the full brunt of the fallout. The mistress demanded last-minute changes to her schedule, then canceled them. The master requested meals at unusual hours, only to leave them untouched. Instructions contradicted each other. Tempers shortened. Tasks multiplied without warning. In a house built on performance, broken routines meant chaos. One morning, a young footman dropped a crystal glass, an accident that might once have earned a gentle reprimand. This time, the master shouted. The butler intervened with calm authority, but the damage was done. The entire staff felt the fear ripple through them. These were not the actions of a family in control. These were the actions of a family unraveling. And soon, society, which had once envied their grandeur, began to sense it too. Because in the Gilded Age, nothing remained hidden forever. Not scandal, not financial decline, not the tension behind a pair of polished double doors. The mansion still gleamed in the sunlight, but those who worked within it knew the truth. The breaking point had passed, and what came next would not be a whisper. It would be a fall. When decline began in a Gilded Age mansion, it did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like a slow extinguishing of light, chandelier by chandelier, room by room, until the glow that had once defined an entire household dimmed into something unrecognizable. In this house, the fall was not sudden. It was steady, merciless, and impossible to stop. The first signs appeared quietly. Servants noticed them the way sailors notice changes in the wind, subtle shifts that suggested an approaching storm. For the first time in years, several upstairs rooms remained closed during the day, their curtains drawn to save on coal. The massive greenhouses, which once overflowed with imported orchids and roses, received fewer shipments. The ladies' personal maids whispered about gowns being reworn not out of preference but necessity. Seasonal staff were not rehired. Repairs were delayed. Accounts were audited with newfound urgency. The butler, who had spent decades mastering discretion, sensed gravity behind each change. He read it in the master's eyes, a shadow of worry that lingered even when he smiled for guests. He read it in the lady's posture, elegant as ever, but strained beneath the weight of preserving appearances. Servants began preparing for dinners that were canceled at the last minute. Invitations grew sparse. Even the flurry of carriages in the circular drive quieted. A mansion that once welcomed hundreds now echoed with emptier halls. The breaking point came in a series of events that unfolded over a single season. It began with the master's business losses becoming public knowledge. Newspapers, once eager to praise the family's lavish events, now reported rumors of debt, lawsuits, and failed ventures. Rivals who had long envied the family's ascent whispered gleefully behind closed doors, predicting ruin with the same enthusiasm they once praised success. Social invitations faded, then vanished altogether. Old money families had long memories and short sympathies. One moment of vulnerability was enough to push a newly accepted family back toward the edges of society. The Gilded Age was built on alliances, but those alliances were fragile. When fortunes shifted, so did loyalties. The lady felt the change most sharply. Friends who once called daily now sent polite regrets. Charity committees quietly removed her name from events. The grand opera box they maintained for years was offered quietly to another family. Her morning tea, once accompanied by stacks of correspondence, now sat alone on her table. In the servants' quarters, the atmosphere grew heavier. The cook reduced menus. The steward cut luxuries. The housemaids polished fewer rooms. Footmen worked fewer shifts but under greater pressure. The slightest mistake now seemed catastrophic, as though maintaining order below could help preserve dignity above. The mansion's grandeur, once its greatest asset, began to feel like a burden. Heating the enormous halls became costly. Maintaining the gardens a monumental task. Repairs that once happened instantly now lingered. A cracked windowpane in the servants' stairwell remained untouched for weeks. A loose banister in the east wing was simply roped off. The orchestra, once hired weekly, was dismissed indefinitely. Guests noticed. Society noticed. And eventually, whispers turned to truth. The family was in trouble. Then came the most devastating shift of all, the auction. It was inevitable, yet heartbreaking. Carriages lined the drive not for a ball, but for a sale. Strangers walked through the mansion with catalogs, pointing at antiques and artworks that had once defined the family's identity. The butler supervised with a stone face, though his hands trembled when unseen. Housemaids watched silently as items they had dusted for years were carried out the front doors. Footmen stood at attention as if performing their duty for the last time. The lady did not attend the auction. She remained in her sitting room, hands clasped tightly, knowing that the life she had curated with such precision was slipping beyond her reach. The master tried to hide the shame, but the agony of losing what he had built was evident in every step he took. The mansion, his monument, his legacy, now felt like a vast, empty stage where the performance had ended. The servants, too, faced uncertainty. A house this large could not function without its staff, but a house in decline could not afford them. Contracts ended. Wages were reduced. Some servants left quietly, seeking work in other estates. Others stayed out of loyalty, though they understood the future was bleak. What remained was a hollowed version of former glory. Chandeliers dimmed. Corridors darkened. Entire wings were locked to save resources. Rooms once filled with guests now stood silent, their furniture gone, leaving only shadows of a life that once dazzled society. And yet, what made the fall so tragic was not the disappearance of luxury, it was the disappearance of certainty. The family, who once stood at the center of social admiration, now found themselves isolated in a mansion too large for their shrinking world. Servants who had built their lives around the routines of this house watched as the very structure that defined them slipped toward abandonment. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The Gilded Age itself was showing cracks. Industrial fortunes were volatile. Social hierarchies were shifting. Modernity was creeping in, and mansions that once symbolized power now symbolized fragility. The fall was not merely a financial loss. It was a revelation that the illusion of effortless grandeur depended on a foundation more delicate than anyone had ever admitted. And once that foundation broke, the descent was inevitable. When the first shovelful of earth was turned to build the mansion, the family imagined a legacy that would flourish for generations. But as the years passed and the decline spread through every corridor, the house no longer felt like a symbol of triumph. It had become a monument to everything the Gilded Age promised, and everything it failed to sustain. In the aftermath of the fall, life inside the mansion changed in ways that felt irreversible. The household, once a bustling organism powered by over 100 servants, shrank almost overnight. The scullery maids were among the first to leave, sent away with modest wages and letters of recommendation written hurriedly by a distracted housekeeper. Footmen followed, their livery uniforms folded and left behind in closets now gathering dust. The kitchen emptied, its great stoves cooling for the first time in years. In the servants' hall, the long table where dozens once ate in shifts now held only a few quiet diners. The remaining staff, the butler, the housekeeper, 2 maids, and a gardener who had tended the grounds since the mansion's earliest days, worked not out of obligation, but out of loyalty and perhaps something more, an understanding that they were all witnessing the end of an era. The family's world contracted just as quickly. Their grand social calendar had vanished. The invitations that once arrived daily were gone. Carriages no longer filled the circular drive. Dinners that had once featured 12 courses now consisted of simple meals served in a smaller, warmer room rather than the cavernous dining hall. The lady of the house carried herself with the same practiced elegance, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She walked less frequently through the grand corridors, choosing instead the intimacy of smaller spaces, her sitting room, the morning parlor, the private corner of the garden that had always brought her peace. Her life, once defined by public performance, had retreated into something quieter, more contemplative. The master changed even more dramatically. He spent long hours in his study, surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, and the fading symbols of authority. The decline of his businesses had wounded him deeply, not only financially but personally. The empire he built, brick by brick, deal by deal, was now a collection of numbers that refused to align. He walked the grounds during hours when he once hosted business associates, his steps slow, almost uncertain. The children felt the shift in ways neither parent intended. Lessons continued, but without the same rigor. Their tutors, sensing the household's fragility, approached their duties with a gentler touch. The children grew quieter, more observant. They asked fewer questions, as though they understood instinctively that the adults around them had no easy answers left to give. Outside the mansion, society watched with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Some whispered that the family had been reckless. Others simply moved on, focusing their attention on the next rising fortune, the next grand estate, the next headline. The Gilded Age was accelerating, and in its rush toward modernity, it left little room for sympathy. The servants who remained witnessed the family's struggle with a kind of solemn clarity. They had always known the truth that society refused to acknowledge. Wealth did not insulate people from sorrow. Grand homes could hold loneliness as easily as joy, and when collapse arrived, the size of the house did nothing to soften its blow. Yet even amid the decay, there were moments of quiet humanity. The butler, who had served the family through triumph and turmoil, continued his duties with unwavering dignity. He polished the remaining silver not because guests might see it, but because it was part of the house's history and his own. He stood at the entrance each morning, waiting for carriages that no longer came, maintaining rituals that gave structure to days otherwise marked by uncertainty. The housekeeper kept the linens fresh, even though few were used now. She oversaw the cleaning of rooms that no longer welcomed visitors, aware that dust, once allowed to settle, could consume a home from the inside out. Her work was less about necessity and more about preservation, a way to hold on to a dignity the family could no longer display publicly. The gardener tended the grounds with a devotion that bordered on reverence. Though fewer funds were allocated for maintenance, he kept the lawns trimmed and the hedges shaped, knowing that once nature reclaimed its grip, the mansion would slip further into decline. Sometimes he found the master standing at the edge of the terrace, staring at the landscape he had once shown proudly to dignitaries and investors. Their exchanges were brief, polite, tinged with an unspoken grief. The house itself bore witness to all of this. The once bright halls dimmed, yet they held echoes of the past, the laughter of guests drifting through high ceilings, the clipped steps of maids moving in perfect formation, the rustle of silk gowns during grand entrances. These memories lingered in the air like perfume that refused to fade, but memory alone could not restore what was lost. Rooms were closed, furniture covered, wings locked to conserve dwindling resources. The house that once felt too large for the world now felt too large for its own family. Its grandeur had become a reminder not of triumph, but of what it took to uphold such a life. And yet in this quieter version of the mansion, something unexpected emerged, a fragile tenderness that had been missing during the heights of wealth. The family, stripped of the relentless demand to perform, found themselves confronting one another more honestly. Their conversations, once shallow and polite, grew deeper. Shared grief created a kind of closeness that prosperity never had. For the first time in years, the lady and the master sat together in the evenings, not as figures preserving a social image, but as two people grappling with the weight of change. For the servants, too, this was a turning point. They served not because of wages, those were modest now, but because of a sense of identity intertwined with the mansion's walls. They had built their lives here, just as the family had. And in this unusual stillness, the relationship between upstairs and downstairs became less defined by hierarchy and more by shared experience. But even as these small, tender moments emerged, the future of the house remained uncertain. Because the Gilded Age was evolving, the economy was shifting, and the world outside the mansion was no longer willing to sustain the excesses that had once defined it. The family had survived the fall, but what came next would test the very foundations of a house built to withstand everything but time. The decades that followed were not dramatic. They were quiet, almost eerily so, and it was in this quiet that the mansion began its slow descent into obscurity. If the Gilded Age had been thunder, this was the long, lingering echo that drifted away until almost no one remembered how loud the noise had once been. After the fall, the family no longer hosted grand balls or lavish dinners. Society, with its short memory and restless appetite, turned its attention to newer fortunes and rising names. The house, once featured in newspapers for its opulence, now appeared only in forgotten references, a mention in a memoir, a faded illustration in an old magazine, a rumor among servants who had worked in the great house that used to be. The decline was not immediate. It crept in like dusk, subtle at first, then consuming. Maintaining a mansion with 100 rooms required endless attention. Without the full staff that once powered it, the house began to feel larger, colder. Seasons changed, and with each winter that passed, something new gave way. The roof tiles loosened. The garden fountains ran dry. The once gleaming ballroom lost its luster, its marble floors dulled by time. The drapes faded under the sun. The woodwork, once polished daily, grew brittle. The butler, housekeeper, and gardener, the last pillars of the old order, did what they could. They kept up routines long after their original purpose had vanished. But the tasks they once oversaw with armies of servants were now theirs alone, and the burden was too vast. The butler aged quickly. His precise steps slowed. though he continued to open the front door each morning with the same ritualistic dignity. It was a habit he could not abandon, a symbol of continuity in a world that had changed beyond recognition. The housekeeper cleaned only the rooms still in use, closing door after door as though sealing memories behind them. Velvet sofas were covered, chandeliers draped with linen cloths to protect them from dust, though in truth, there were fewer and fewer people left to notice. The gardener tended the grounds until the day he could no longer lift his tools. When he retired, the gardens returned to nature with startling speed. Roses grew wild, vines crept up the terrace walls. The perfectly manicured hedges softened into unruly shapes. The family itself aged within these fading walls, their lives shrinking until they occupied only a fraction of the great house that once announced their arrival to the world. The children grew up differently from their parents. They had not known the burdens of hosting balls or maintaining appearances. Their childhood memories were divided between two worlds, one filled with echoes of grandeur, the other marked by the quiet fragility that followed. When they reached adulthood, they pursued lives that pulled them away from the estate, careers, cities, marriages unburdened by the demands of high society. They visited out of duty or affection, but the house no longer held the power it once did. It was too large, too expensive, too symbolic of a chapter that had ended. By the 1920s, America was changing. The world no longer admired the sprawling estates of the past. The country was embracing modernity, automobiles, factories, bustling cities, middle-class prosperity. The Gilded Age aesthetic felt heavy, outdated, a relic of a time when fortunes soared and collapsed with dizzying speed. During these forgotten years, the mansion existed in a kind of suspended reality. It was neither fully alive nor fully abandoned. It was cared for just enough to stand, but no longer revered. Its owners lived quietly, their lives marked by modest routines rather than grand displays. You could walk through the halls and still feel the ghost of a violin echoing from a long-ago ball. You could pass the servants' staircase and imagine the hurried footsteps of maids preparing for a dinner that would never come again. Time left fingerprints everywhere, wallpaper peeled delicately at the edges. The once brilliant parquet floors faded in inconsistent patterns. Plasterwork cracked in hairline fractures like veins beneath skin. A faint chill lingered in the unused wings, no matter the season. Outside, the grand drive, once filled with carriages and guests, grew uneven as roots pushed up through the gravel. The wrought iron gates rusted at their hinges. The fountains, empty now, collected leaves. And yet, even in decline, the mansion retained a kind of solemn beauty. Not the youthful extravagance it once flaunted, but a quiet, dignified melancholy, an understanding that its time had passed and that no amount of restoration could return it to the world that had created it. Occasionally, curious travelers would inquire about the estate. Some sought to purchase it as a summer retreat. Others wanted to demolish it for the land. But the family held on not out of pride, but out of memory. The house, even in its faded state, remained part of their identity. Selling it felt like erasing the past entirely, so it remained, a silent giant of another era, too grand for the present, too costly to maintain fully, too beloved to abandon. It stood through storms, decades, and shifting tides of fortune, its stone walls weathered but steadfast. Until one day, as always happens, time rendered a final decision. The last surviving member of the original family passed away. With no one left to inhabit the house, no grand balls to host, no servants to maintain its rituals, the mansion entered its true forgotten years. The estate was sealed, the windows shuttered, the doors locked. Dusk claimed the rooms, birds nested in the rafters, ivy embraced the stone. The Gilded Age had been a moment, dazzling, extravagant, fragile. And now, the house that once embodied its ambitions had become the monument of its memory. But even in its quiet decay, the mansion was not done telling its story. History had merely paused, waiting for someone someday to rediscover its forgotten halls. For years after the mansion fell silent, it stood alone, a vast, slumbering relic hidden behind overgrown gardens and rusted gates. Locals passed it on country drives and whispered that it was haunted by its own past. Children dared each other to run up the abandoned front steps. Artists sketched its silhouette against the evening sky, but no one had truly stepped inside, not until the day the door opened again. It began with a historian, a quiet, meticulous scholar who had long been fascinated by the Gilded Age and the hidden stories of the families who built its palaces. She had read brief mentions of the mansion in old society columns, seen its ghostly outline in forgotten architectural books, and traced the family's rise and fall through distant records that left many questions unanswered. Most dismissed the house as too far gone, too expensive to restore, too large to be useful. But historians think differently. They see what others overlook. To her, the mansion was not an obsolete structure. It was a time capsule, untouched, undisturbed, waiting. After months of inquiries and paperwork, she was granted permission to enter. Her first steps through the front door echoed through the marble hall, startling in their clarity. Dust rose in soft clouds. The smell of age, wood, paper, and time itself settled around her. She stood for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through faded curtains. And then she felt it, not fear, not sadness, but awe, because even in decay, the mansion was breathtaking. The great hall, though dulled by time, still held its sweeping staircase and carved balustrades. The ballroom's high ceiling remained intact, showing hints of the painted celestial mural that once astonished guests. In the dining room, the long table remained where it had always been, a skeletal outline of past feasts. The library, though lined with dusty shelves, still held hundreds of books whose pages crackled faintly when touched. But what moved her most was not the grandeur. It was the traces of the people who had lived and worked here. She found a servant's ledger tucked behind a cabinet, names, duties, schedules written in precise handwriting. She found children's sketches under a loose floorboard, drawings of carriages, birds, and an enormous house with too many windows. She found 2 letters hidden beneath a false drawer, one written by the lady of the house, one by the master, neither addressed, both filled with regret never spoken aloud. The mansion was not a ruin. It was a story. As she explored, the historian documented everything, every cracked tile, every forgotten item, every thread of fabric that had survived a century of silence. The house began to breathe again under her careful attention, as though relieved to be seen. Soon, word spread. Architects visited to examine the structure. Archivists arrived to catalog artifacts. Conservationists walked the grounds, imagining how the gardens had once looked. Photographers captured the eerie beauty of dust-covered chandeliers and sunbeams filtering through shattered windows. The mansion entered a new chapter, not one of luxury, but of rediscovery. The local historical society, recognizing the significance of the estate, began discussing possibilities. Should it be restored, preserved as is, converted into a museum? The debates were lively, passionate, filled with reverence for the past and questions about the future. Meanwhile, the historian continued her work. She traced the family's lineage, uncovered scandals long forgotten, pieced together the servants' lives, and reconstructed events that had shaped the household's rise and eventual collapse. Her articles drew attention from academic circles and eventually from the public. People were fascinated, not just by the wealth that was familiar territory, but by the humanity behind it. The servants' quarters, the order books, the scraps of correspondence, the routines that once dictated the rhythm of daily life. The hidden world beneath the grandeur captivated modern audiences in a way no ballroom ever had. The mansion became a symbol once more, but this time not of wealth. It became a symbol of memory, labor, and the fragility of eras that believed themselves eternal. Visitors who were granted early tour stepped through the rooms with a kind of reverence. They whispered without meaning to. They paused at doorways, imagining the house in its prime. They touched banisters worn smooth by the hands of servants hurrying at dawn. They stood in the nursery and felt an ache for children who had grown up in a world both privileged and burdened. And yet, for all the fascination, the mansion remained unchanged at its core, a silent witness to its own story. It had stood through wars, depressions, social revolutions, and the entire rise and fall of the Gilded Age. No modern renovation could erase that history. No new owner could fully reshape it. But perhaps that was its purpose now, not to dazzle, not to impress, but to teach. To remind the world that behind every grand age lies a hidden world of labor, sacrifice, and human stories too often erased. When the historian stood again at the great hall, ready to leave for the day, she understood something profound. The house did not need to return to what it once was. It only needed to be remembered. The Gilded Age had been gilded, not golden. Behind the gleaming surfaces lay the lives of hundreds of people who had kept the illusion alive, servants whose names had never graced a society page, but whose labor had shaped an entire era. And now, at last, their world was being seen. The mansion waited quietly for what would come next, restoration, preservation, or something in between. But one truth had already become clear. Its story was no longer forgotten. It had been reclaimed. In the end, the mansion stood neither as a ruin nor as a triumph, but as something far more compelling, a reminder. A reminder of the Gilded Age's shimmering promise, its fragile illusions, its hidden engines of labor, and the human stories, grand and humble, that had once pulsed through every corridor. By the time historians, architects, and preservationists completed their work, the house had taken on a new identity. It was no longer simply a private estate or a relic of wealth. It had become a bridge between past and present, a place where visitors could step into an era that shaped modern America in ways both visible and invisible. The grand hallways, though still lightly scarred by time, echoed once more with footsteps. Not those of footmen rushing to polish silver or servants hurrying to prepare chamber fires, but of people who came to learn to see what life had been like inside a palace that once required over 100 men and women to sustain. Guides walked visitors through the restored servant corridors, explaining the hierarchy that had governed every waking moment. They showed the bells with numbered brass plates, each tied to a different room in the house. They demonstrated the silent signals that once directed armies of maids and footmen. They opened the heavy doors to the basement kitchens, where enormous stoves once produced meals fit for royalty. They pointed to the worn steps of the servants' staircase, curved delicately at the edges from decades of hurried footsteps, and visitors listened, quietly, thoughtfully, because they realized they had never learned this part of history in school books or museums. The Gilded Age had always been told as a story of millionaires, industrial barons, society queens, architects of empire. But here, within these walls, visitors encountered the truth. The era was built not just by those who lived in luxury, but by those who sustained it. The housekeeper's ledger became one of the most studied artifacts. Researchers marveled at her precision, chores assigned to the minute, rotations of duties, seasonal adjustments, inventories so detailed they rivaled military records. Her handwriting revealed not just her responsibility, but her authority, quiet, disciplined, indispensable. The butler's pantry, restored with every original drawer and polished handle, became another focal point. His notes, found carefully preserved in a drawer, spoke volumes about his pride and burdens. He had been the unseen architect of every dinner, every social event, every flawless presentation. His world was one of order, dignity, and expectation. In the children's room, their sketches remained pinned behind protective glass, simple drawings, yet powerful echoes of a life divided between privilege and constraint. And in a small display case, the two letters, one written by the master, one by the lady, were placed side by side. Their words, though personal and filled with unspoken regret, told a story larger than themselves. They were symbols of an age built on appearances, where emotions often hid behind decorum. Visitors came expecting to see wealth. They left remembering the servants. They came curious about luxury. They left reflecting on the cost required to maintain it. School groups visited, walking through the mansion with wide eyes, learning not just about prosperity, but about the systems of work, hierarchy, and endurance that made such prosperity possible. University students wrote thesis papers on domestic labor. Preservationists studied the architecture of service spaces. Filmmakers sought permission to capture the estate on camera. And slowly the mansion became a living archive, a place where the hidden world of the Gilded Age could finally be understood in full. But the house also offered something intangible, a perspective on how eras rise and fall, and how the people within them shape those rises and falls. When the historian, the same woman who first entered the abandoned estate, stood once more in the great hall after the restoration had been completed, she felt an unexpected emotion. Not triumph, not pride, but reverence. The grand staircase before her, though softened by time, still carried the essence of an age defined by ambition. The tapestries, though muted, whispered stories of craftsmanship. The marble floors gleamed softly, reflecting the elegant restraint of restoration rather than the flamboyance of the mansion's prime. She realized what the mansion had finally become, not a glorification of wealth, not a condemnation of excess, but a testament to balance, to remembering all parts of a story, not just its glittering facade. For every great age, she understood, leaves behind two histories, one that is celebrated and one that is forgotten. The celebrated history is easy to see: the balls, the architecture, the fortunes, the headlines. The forgotten history hides beneath: the coals shoveled before dawn, the laundry pressed by lamplight, the meals prepared in sweltering kitchens, the hands that polished, mended, ironed, tended, and served. This mansion, this great, quiet survivor, finally united both histories. Before leaving, the historian walked through the servants' staircase one last time, running her hand lightly along the worn wooden rail. She imagined the footsteps that once thundered here at dawn, the whispered instructions, the muffled laughter of maids on rare free moments, the fatigue carried up and down these steps for decades. She whispered softly, not to the past, but to the memory of it, "You are seen now." Then she stepped outside into the fading light, where the gardens, still slightly wild but beautiful, swayed gently in the breeze. The mansion behind her stood in dignified silence, holding the stories of all who had lived and labored within. It was no longer a symbol of wealth, nor a ruin of forgotten dreams. It was a lesson, a monument to labor, a window into a vanished world, a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who stand in the spotlight, but also by those who build it from the shadows. And in that truth, the legacy of the mansion, and the servants who once ran it, finally found its voice. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden world of America's Gilded Age, consider subscribing for more meticulously crafted historical documentaries. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments. What period or forgotten world would you like us to explore next?